Good evening, everyone. I'm James Rattray. I'm the chairman of the Soldiers of KIlliecrankie group. We're a local constituted group focused on our battlefield. I'm telling the story of the Battle of Killiecrankie using the accounts of two first-hand combatants who were here. So Ewan Cameron of Lochiel, head of Clan Cameron, he left us a very detailed account for the Jacobite side, and Hugh McKay, General Hugh McKay, commanded the Scottish government, the William and Mary government, the Lowland Army, Scottish Army, and he left a full account as well. In the first 8 sessions, we talked about the two monarchs and why they were trying to gain control of Scotland, their two commanders, and why the two Scottish armies were totally different and reflected society in Scotland. The race for the Castle of Blair, we talked about the Pass of Killiecrankie issues, how Dundee chooses the battlefield and leaving Mackay absolutely no options at all. 1850s warfare, the two armies' battle lines, how they were drawn up and what the issues each side saw with the terrain. The pre-battle skirmish, and on Thursday we went through the battle itself. In the 9th session, we're going to look at both of our first-hand combatants' assessment of the battle, and then what we're going to do is talk about the issues today. This, where we're standing on the battlefield now, really sums up a lot of what Killiecrankie is about, and also some of the issues that the new road going through the battlefield hasn't taken into account. On Tuesday, the session will look at the implications of the Battle of Killiecrankie for the whole of Scotland as assessed by these two first-hand accounts in 1689. So what I'm going to do now is start by showing you the location and to remind you where we are. And this is where we are, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Inverness at the top, and we're here in the middle of Scotland. Looking back on the reverse of here, this shows you the battlefield as a whole. This is where Blair Atholl is, first filming location. Down here is the Pass of Killiecrankie, National Trust Visitor Centre, a lot of you will know here. And the Soldier's Leap is there. That was the second location. Third location was on the flat field on the road as you go to Blair Atholl, the Standing Stone field, and that's where we hold our events. 4th and 5th was here. This is the A9 running through here. 6th was right up with the Jacobite army with fantastic views. 7 was the skirmish location. 8 was again looking down across the battlefield just below where the Highland army was located, and that's where we talked about the battle. And today we're going to be here, 9. We're just below the A9, opposite where the skirmish took place, where, if you remember correctly, Mackay sent one of the captains from Mackay's regiment that was opposite the skirmish across up there to flush out the Loch Arbor men who were in some buildings there. If you look on the battle lines, this is the Gernig burn, Alt Clun burn over to the side here. The Scottish government army, Mackay's army, William and Mary's army was lined up thin line here. The Jacobites were at the top, and that's where the skirmish was. That was where we described the battle, and this is where we are today, just below the A9, opposite the skirmish field, standing literally where Mackay's regiment was at that time. So okay, let me just show you the location of where we are. And behind me here is Arad, which we've shown. This is where Mackay had his cavalry in this area of the field. And if we pan round, we can see the A9 is literally where the trees are. All these trees were added at the last time of the construction of the A9. Well, this area in front of us here, in front of us here is where a lot of the musket balls were found by Two Men in the Trench in 2003 and also Transport Scotland. If we pan round again, we can see the hills up over the top, and you can see the terrain in front of us, how it falls away. And in our opinion, this is where there's a very strong argument to say this is where McKay lined his army up, along this ridge along here, and we'll go into that later on. But swinging further on, the pass of Killiecrankie is to the left of that single tall tree. You can where those fir trees are, through there is the pass of Killiecrankie, and we'll stand, and I'll stand here and talk to you and tell you what happened and the accounts. Copy. I'm going to start with Lochiel, and see if I can get his hat on. Not so windy today, and hopefully I'm looking very smart. In the last session, Lochiel told us, and this is describing the battle that had taken place, about the middle of the night, the army returned from the pursuit. The enemy took the opportunity of retreating in the dark. When the day returned, the Highlanders went and took a view of the field of battle, where the dreadful effects of their fury appeared in many horrible figures. And I believe this is the spot that they walked over, somewhere around here, because they came back and looked at, and this is Lochiel, he's looking at his clansmen, and he describes what happened. The fiercest fighting took place on this ridge along here. And he goes on and he said, the enemy laid in heaps, almost in the order they were posted, but so disfigured with wounds and so hashed and mangled that even the victors could not look upon the amazing proofs of their own agility and strength without surprise and horror. Previously we've did a lament depicting this scene here, and if you look under videos under the Soldiers of Killiecrankie Facebook page, you will find that lament. And what we did is we laid tartan plaids on the field to show how these Lochaber men may well have fallen here, and it also shows the redcoats in lines as they fell, as Lochiel told us. And if you get a chance at the end of this, go and look for that video. And the pipe tune was from that period, played, and as the piper walked over the field, and a lot of people have told us how emotional it is. So he talked about one of the things that, one of the problems that the Scottish Government Army regular troops had was that McKay asked them to fire their single shot that they had in their musket, he called them firelocks, he didn't call them muskets, at 100 paces, and they fired by volley. The whole idea is to drive the Highlanders away, so the fire would be so ferocious. And at the end of this, what their only defence was a plug bayonet. And what they had to do was find this off their side and get it and stick it into the end of their barrel, because it's literally a plug, and that was then their defence. The problem was, and McKay is attributed with developing the modern bayonet, along with a French guy, Vauban, V-A-U-B-A-N, a French military engineer, is the other person who's a possible claimant for the modern bayonet, because McKay realised for people to fire their muskets and then to scrabble around looking for that bayonet was nigh on impossible. And I suspect once they'd fired it, they literally had no defence against these Highland clans. Let me continue with Lochiel. Many had their heads divided in two halves by one blow. Others had their skulls cut off above the ears by a backstroke like a nightcap. Their thick buff belts were not sufficient to defend their shoulders from the deep gashes as almost disclosed their entrails. Several picks, we call them pikes, small swords and the like weapons were cut quite through, and some that had skull capes, and I would assume like a helmet, had them so beaten into their brains that they died upon the spot. The Highlanders, as I have said, paid dear enough for their victory, but it was remarked that few or none of them were killed after they drew their swords, and the greatest part of them fell within a few paces of their enemy when they received the last fire, before they themselves discharged their guns, after which their loss was inconsiderable. Lochiel says of himself, lost in action 120 of his men. Remember, he came here with 240 Lochaber men, which is just one half of his number, and was occasioned by a furious fire that was received from the flank of Lieven's battalion. And Lieven's battalion was over there, and if you remember, they had nobody, no clan regiment to attack Lieven's. So they must have seen the Camerons, McKay's regiment coming down to attack McKay's. They saw nobody coming to attack them, and they did a court conversion. They swung round, and as Lochiel said, a flank fire from Lieven's regiment, which no one had to engage. So not only did the Lochaber men had to take on McKay's, but the Lieven's was also discharging all their muskets into them. His post was against McKay's own regiment. He talks about the Cameronians, which he routed and destroyed in a manner that few of them ever returned to their colours. So he talks about the loss that McKay's own regiment had, and we'll hear how McKay himself talks about this loss and how significant this part of the battlefield was. Lochiel continued, so keen was he, Lochiel, that day, that he spoke to his men one by one and took their several engagements, either to conquer or die. So this is before the attack. He took time to impress on his men individually how important they had to do is carry that charge through. And he said Lochiel was past his 63rd year of age, but strong, healthy and vigorous. His men obeyed him so readily when he commanded them to march, but he was not able to keep pace with them, but leaving them to the protection of God, he sat down by the way and deliberately pulling off his shoes that pinched him. And he said he had the agility to get up with them, to catch up with them, just as they drew their swords. So that is describing what happened here. And when Lochiel came back with his Highlanders, and they were shocked by what they saw. What I'm going to do now is tell you what McKay had to say. McKay, as you know, is the Scottish Government Army commander, experienced military man with the Anglo-Dutch Brigade, and he came over here with William of Orange, and he said the enemy lost on the field 6 to our 1. You've got to remember, he's writing this as the defeated commander. The fire to our right having been continued and brisk, and so his right is along here in this direction, all along this front from our house behind us. So he's saying it's in this direction. The fire to our right having been continued and brisk, whereby not only Dundee with several gentlemen of quality of the countries of Angus and Perthshire, but also so many of the best gentlemen of the Highlanders, particularly of the MacDonalds of the Isles and Glengarry. If you remember, in his description of the battle, he confused MacDonalds with the Camerons. We know when he talks of MacDonalds, he's talking of the Camerons, because the clan Cameron attacked here, and he got mixed up in his account. And he said these gentlemen were killed coming down the hill upon Hastings, the general's McKay's regiment, Lieven's, which had best fire, and all the execution. So you've got to remember, he's the defeated commander. He's telling his side of the story, and he's saying they lost 6 to every one of ours, and all their top people in Perthshire and Angus, as well as the Highlands. So even though we lost, we dealt them a real powerful blow. And of this spot, McKay tells us, particularly McKay's battalion, the general's battalion, made great fire, being well exercised by his brother, who was a lieutenant colonel, commanded the battalion, and his brother was killed on this spot, with several of the old soldiers, pikemen, who stood by him after the shot ran away. He said he also lost 2 captains, 5 subalterns of that battalion killed, and the other 2 captains left wounded on the spot. But certainly the greatest force of that side was poured upon McKay's battalion. So he's saying the Highlanders, Dundee, decided to attack McKay's battalion more than any other. But we know from Lochiel they're all appointed individual battalions. So again, that's the side of the loser. The reason was for pouring all this force was that some were officers among the enemy. So he's saying some of the enemy had been officers in the battalion and had carried arms in the regiment abroad, and were of the opinion if Mackay's regiment were breached, it would facilitate the rest of the work. And again, you can remember, this is Mackay telling his side of the story. Lochiel has not mentioned any of that. So, carrying on with Mackay, but there was a great difference between the regiment now and before, he's saying, when they had known it. And also the other 2 regiments came out of Holland, so we're talking about the Anglo-Scots brigades here. He said were mostly new levied men, the king having taken away the best and oldest men to recruit the Dutch regiments in England. So again, this is his bit of his excuse for what happened, because he's saying the Highlanders focused on here, although Mackay brought a terrible death to all these leading people on the Highland side, but the Dutch regiments that he had here, he had 3 of them, Anglo-Dutch Brigade, who, if you remember, were the top regiments in Europe at that time. And he's saying the best men from these regiments were kept in England. So I'm going to just go back and mention Lochiel briefly. Lochiel, in his memoirs, takes quite a bit of time, which I'm not going to go through here, defending the Highlanders, because what he says in his memoirs, there were unjust accusations by the Earl of Balcarras, Balcarrass. I don't know quite how you pronounce that. And he says, who was a prisoner of the state at the time in the castle of Edinburgh. So this Earl had gone around making accusations, and these accusations that Lochiel said he made, he said he charged the Highlanders with losing the fruits of so important a victory by their unseasonable address in falling on the baggage train. You've got to remember that Mackay had 3,500 men. At the end of it, he got to Stirling with 400 to 500. So it seems a very unreasonable accusation to say they've lost the fruits of their victory. And also the other thing Lochiel took time to argue with, this Balcarras, Earl of Balcarras, put down the loss of brave Viscount Dundee upon the cowardice of Sir Donald MacDonald and his men. And Lochiel totally refuted that. And as we know from the account, Sir Donald MacDonald fought on the extreme right wing. We know from Lochiel's account that Dundee fell in this area. But he spent quite a lot of his book countering these accusations. And Lochiel goes on and says, I have been more particular describing this action in all its circumstances, because I have observed those who have wrote of these times have either out of partiality or for want of information have not given a true account. And he goes on, he said, I have favoured the world with a full and genuine relation of it. Lochiel was countering misinformation, and in our age of today we talk about Facebook and social media and misinformation. So 330 years ago it was no different. The second part of what I would like to talk about this evening is where we stand, and it sums up the issues that we face with Scottish battlefields, and here in Killiecrankie in particular. As I've said several times, the A9 being duelled through the battlefield was an opportunity for us all to look at the battlefield and how we preserve it for future generations. And in my opinion, we've lost this. It's been a missed opportunity. And for us ordinary people, the citizens of Scotland, we can't do anything but watch what happens next. But I just want to take you through a few things. In May 2011, the Scottish government, our government, and the headlines read things like battlefields, historic sites get heritage protection in Scotland, and the inventory of historic battle sites formed a register of which Killiecrankie is one. And part of that register said any developments had to take into consideration of the battlefield. And in my opinion, this has singularly been missed out with Killiecrankie right from the very start. And I'll quote what Fiona Hislop, it said in May 2012, the Scottish Secretary for Cultural and External Affairs, and I absolutely agree with what she said. She said it was crucial that sites that had contributed to Scotland's history and heritage are recognised. Our battle sites draw tourists from all over the world, and they represent a huge educational resource. Through them we can understand the evolution of Scotland and learn about key historical figures and their role in shaping our culture. I couldn't agree more with that statement. But let me just continue with the point I want to make here. The people of Killiecrankie believed that our battlefield, as part of the inventory of historic battlefields, had some kind of protection, and there would be some proper due care taken. And what we have discovered, this has not happened. The inventory of battlefields has not had its effects. Transport Scotland has held all the trump cards. And in January 2020, this January just passed, the Scottish Government appointed reporter had a public inquiry, and this reporter is a planner. And in my opinion, and I suspect anyone even who is neutral, when you see 8 or 9 professionals, including lawyers paid by the state with limitless funds, and it came across, it was all about Transport Scotland winning the argument, not about looking at what is best for the battlefield. And who were they opposing? The ordinary people of Killiecrankie who had no funds, who had to work, who weren't full-time. And I think the inquiry had some key things missing with it. We talk about the Scottish battlefield inventory, and who's the custodian of that? Historic Environment Scotland. But they weren't at the inquiry. So you've got to ask yourself, who was at the inquiry? The developer was there. The very people who should be looking after our battlefields weren't there. And who was there to give specialist advice? So let me now just take it to the point about this spot. The Transport Scotland at the inquiry made a point, and I'm going to hopefully show you. This is our house here. This is their document. This is where they believe their argument for the alignment of McKay's regiment, the Scottish Government Army, William and Mary's regiment, was lined up. This is where we are here, and this is where they put up the clans along here. So we looked at that, and just to show you a slightly different one, this is again their documents, which shows the topography. All the trees have been taken away, but it shows you the lumps and bumps of the ground. And this here, this is McKay's, Hastings. They've put the army across a ravine, which I find very surprising. And this is where we're standing. And this is where I believe, is where this line should be. And I've drawn it on all the maps you've seen along this ridge. And I'll explain to you why. Because what we did at the inquiry was we found, just by doing a cross section, that this is where they put the army, their alignment, the developer, the transport people who are not specialists in battlefields, their argument is they believe the line was here. So we drew a cross section from here to where the musket balls were found. And if you look on here, this is a man standing here firing and musket balls go in straight lines. You can't get the musket balls here because the hill is in the way. The ground's in the way. Musket balls fly in straight lines. So we then went to another position, and we then went to the very right and tried to get a musket ball into the position where they are found. And the same thing happened. You can't because of the terrain. So let's go to the next one. We then thought, let's try the middle of this area. How do we get these musket balls up onto this flat area we're standing now? Exactly the same thing happened. You can't do it unless you lob them up, and my brother said at the inquiry as if they are hand grenades. So what we then did, we asked a GIS specialist, and I hadn't a clue what a GIS specialist meant, Geographic Information Systems, to look at that. And what is his expertise? The technology is the same as used for telephone masts. When you put up a telephone mast, you want to make sure that mast gives you as great a coverage as possible, because telephone waves travel in straight lines like musket balls. And so they want to know a baseline. So this GIS specialist had a look, and what he did was he looked at where these musket balls were. So again, looking at this, down here is where Transport Scotland placed the Scottish Government Army line. And remember, they're road builders, they're not specialists in battlefields. This is where we're standing, up here. And this GIS specialist said it's impossible from where the road builder, Transport Scotland, have put the Scottish Government Army line for the musket balls to land on this terrace. And it's such a fundamental failing. I just wonder how much this inquiry is costing us, the taxpayer. This whole inquiry and the whole of this process here on the battlefield has not been considered properly or fairly, and we are the custodians of this for future generations. So what can we do about this? Well, there's nothing we can do, because the Scottish bodies, probably like most public bodies all over the world, only let their citizens make comments at certain times. And we, as the people of Killiecrankie, have objected to these proposals. We believe they're flawed. And this public inquiry we just had, they lined up all the guns, including lawyers, to take on the ordinary citizens. We didn't have lawyers, the ordinary people of Killiecrankie. And in 10th of January this year, Nick Groom, the Transport Scotland Major Projects person, responded to letters that we'd sent to Nicola Sturgeon. He said, Scottish ministers are the decision makers in this process and will ultimately make a decision whether or not to proceed with a scheme after they have considered the recommendations made by the reporter as part of the inquiry process. It is not therefore appropriate to comment on the proposals or objections that have been raised at this time. So even though we can see major flaws in this inquiry, we as citizens of Scotland, and taking it of Fiona Hislop's words, the importance of battlefields like this, and you've followed that through the whole of this story, we are helpless. And I just wonder what all this will cost us. Anyway, leave that. On Tuesday, we're looking at Lochiel and McKay's assessment of what happened, how important was the battle, where does Scotland go after this. We'll find William and Mary's supporters in turmoil, wondering where to, and some people changing sides. So anyway, thank you for following the series so far. Thank you for your comments and likes. See you on Tuesday at 7 o'clock.